Hey guys, Greg Z here, and in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create a realistic leaf material in Redshift. Okay, so I've got a scene set up here with a basic plane that's going to represent our leaf geometry, and I've scaled this plane relative to the size of a human that might occupy my scene. And with this, we want to make sure that we've got all the correct textures. So I've gone ahead and scanned a leaf texture, and I've got a front and back, and from these two I've been able to create the rest of our textures in Photoshop. So I've got an alpha, roughness, specular, and a translucency map. And if I open up the hypershade, you'll see I've gone ahead and created a material for the front and the back side of our leaf. And these are sharing the textures all except the front diffuse texture. So under the backlight translucency, I've plugged in our translucency map, and by default you'll see that the weight is going to be set to 0. Now in most cases, if you set the weight to 1, you'll find that for something as large as a tree illuminated by a directional sunlight, a weight of 1 is almost in all cases going to be too much. So I usually stick to something like 0.3 to 0.5, and that's going to give us the most natural translucency for something like a leaf. So I'm also going to set the IOR to something like 1.3, as I find that something like the default of 1.5 is a bit too strong for a leaf of this kind. So when you're doing test renders of your leaf, you just want to play with these values until you get something that looks the way you would expect it to. So I'm just going to render this plane here, and it's got the front material applied. And you'll see that we're getting some of the translucency coming through here. And in order to get that to show up, we want to create some sort of a light behind the leaf. So in this case, I've got a area light with a fairly low intensity of around 5. So I've got a second plane here, and it's got the back material applied. So if I just render these two together, you'll see that we're getting the front material applied on this one and the back material on this one, and they both have translucency. So what we want to do is we want to create a new material, and we want to feed both of these front and back materials into them. And we want to switch it based on the direction of the camera in relation to the surface of our leaf geometry. So basically, if our camera is facing the front of the leaf, we want to show the front shader. And if it's showing the back, we want to show the back shader. So in order to do that, I've got both of these materials here, and I'm just going to create a Redshift Rayswitch node. And you'll see that there's a few options here in the Rayswitch, but the important one for this tutorial is the camera section. So I'm going to enable the front and back option here, and under the color input I'm going to grab the front shader, and for the back face color I'm going to put the back shader. And if I apply this Rayswitch to both these planes and just give it a render, we should get the same result. So if I turn the camera around to the opposite direction and render again, you'll see that now we're getting the opposite result. So the last thing we want to do is we want to cut out the alpha from our leaf textures here. So I'm just going to create a Redshift Sprite node, and under the shader input I'm going to grab our Rayswitch and plug that in. And I'm just going to copy the path here and plug in our alpha texture. Okay, so if I go back and apply our sprite node to these two planes, and I render again, you'll see that we now have our leaf shader correctly cut out by the sprite node. So the last thing we want to do is apply our leaf material to a plant or a tree. So I've got a sample tree here, and it's fairly heavy at around 2.5 million polys. So this is a tree you might want to put up close to the camera or use as a hero tree throughout a scene. So I'm just going to give this a render and see what it looks like with our leaf shader. So you can see we're getting a fairly decent result here, and you can see some of the translucency showing up here where the sunlight is hitting the leaves. And we've only got a 34-second render time, so that's pretty good considering that the tree is so dense. And we could take it a bit further and enable GI, and that will give us a bit more lift in the shadowed areas, but for most cases this is a good enough result. So that's a basic example of how you can create a double-sided leaf material in Redshift.